Without further ado, I'll welcome Dr. Patrice Lindsay, Director of Stroke and System Change here at Heart and Stroke.
Good morning and afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us for this webinar. We've had an outstanding response to this webinar with over 1,000 people registered, which is a real testament to how important these topics are and how much everybody is looking for guidance and information on these topics. So huge thank you to everybody for joining us today. Afterwards, as Lisa said, please share this with your networks, the link, and we make them available, and we do get quite a few people watching afterwards, so that's awesome. I would like to take this opportunity to introduce and very graciously thank all of our speakers today. We've brought you an outstanding lineup. Our first speaker is going to be Amanda Horner. Amanda is a volunteer with the Heart and Stroke Foundation, has been a volunteer for several years now, and I've had many opportunities to spend time with Amanda, who's awesome and an inspiration to me. Amanda had a stroke at the age of 30 and a second one at 33. With her husband and 2 young toddlers, she underwent a brainstem resection, and she's spent most of her recovery doing self-advocacy and self-directed rehab. She's been an incredible advocate and guide for other stroke survivors. And as someone with lived experience, she's contributed on many of our committees and really played an active role in Saskatchewan on their expert panels, but also just as a go-to person for all things stroke in Saskatchewan. And she's been, we're very grateful to Amanda for coming in and helping us today. Our next presenter after Amanda is Bobby Stojanoski. Sorry, Bobby. He's a research scientist at the Brain and Mind Institute and research professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of Western Ontario, which is where I graduated from, so love that. His research focuses on examining various lifestyle factors that influence changes in higher level cognition in children, adolescents, and adults. And I've heard him talk, and he's a fascinating speaker. Our next speakers are a duo. We get the dynamic duo of Ada Tang. Ada is a physical therapist and associate professor in the School of Rehab Sciences at McMaster University and a clinician-scientist within our Ontario Heart and Stroke. She has extensive clinical experience in neurorehabilitation, which she carries into her research program that's focused on exercise and cardiovascular health in people living with stroke. She will be co-presenting today with Julie Richardson, who is a professor and associate dean or assistant dean in the School of Rehab Sciences at McMaster University. Her research interest in stroke involves evaluating interventions that address functional outcomes and examining the long-term management post-stroke. And their talk today about community exercise programs, which are applicable to stroke, but also have lots of implications for people with heart disease as well, will be a nice way to round out this presentation. So without further ado, I will just remind you of the objectives. I'll just give you a minute to read them all. We're really going to look at the importance of physical and cognitive exercise, discuss some of the interventions, look at what's available out there and what's a good program and programs that you should be concerned about or be wary of or be more critical in thinking about. And the end goal of this is for you to have new tools that you can share with your patients and offer to people you work with as they pursue their recovery. So I will now turn it over to Amanda to be our first presenter today.
Thanks, Patty, and thanks for having me today. As Patty said in her introduction, I've had 2 hemorrhage strokes in the last coming up 8 years. And what led to my strokes was I had a cavernous malformation. And for those of you that do not know what a cavernous malformation is, it's basically a tangle of capillaries, and often they are found in the brain or in the spinal cord. And mine happened to be in the brainstem. And capillaries, as many probably know, are generally thin-walled naturally. So they have the tendency to leak blood. And when they're in a tangle, a knotted tangle, that's what they'll do. And in my case, I was born with this in my brainstem. And during my first stroke or hemorrhage, that was the discovery of this malformation. So that was basically my best case scenario for a stroke. It was slow, light leak, and luckily I recovered no problem within a few weeks, just on my own, no therapy required. 3 years later, however, I had another bleed. It was significant, a lot of blood. Again, it was a slow bleed out of the capillaries, so it took a number of weeks for the blood to kind of engulf an area in the brainstem. So at this time, I started losing function on my body. I lost the ability to walk and talk, to eat. I had left side hemiparesis. I had right facial droop. I had trouble hearing loss, vision loss, and so it was quite devastating because, of course, I did have 2 young toddlers. I spent 10 weeks in the hospital. I was released. I was able to walk. When I was released, I was able to eat again, and I was able to walk assisted. But it was really up to me to get back. I was put on a wait list for outpatient therapy, but there were no real community programs available to me at the time. I mean, there's one, I'm in Saskatoon, which is the biggest hub in Saskatchewan, and there is one community program. However, I was advised that this probably wasn't suited to me, just based on my age and also my physical ability and motivation. So I was fortunate. I had private insurance, so I did do some physical therapy on my own, but really self-directed, very motivated, very driven to get back. And maybe it was just a stroke of luck or what have you, but I was able to make a full recovery within about 6 to 7 months post-stroke. However, I couldn't risk a third bleed, and that's when they did the brainstem resection. So we're coming up 4 years now on that surgery. And since that surgery, again, I came out of the surgery with some physical deficits, very similar to what I had as a stroke. So at that time, since that time, you know, I've had a lot of experience. I've seen dozens and dozens of specialists, of just healthcare professionals in different modalities. I've tried many different therapies and modalities, more than I can say, and, you know, I've gone on to have over a dozen more surgeries and procedures done. So I do have a lot of experience, I guess. What I've learned from that time is that I haven't had anybody to really rely on, a healthcare professional that I can go to for advice and have them say, yeah, this is the research we see here, or these things are available. All of that has been self-directed. It has been myself being able to, thankfully, being cognitively strong and having the ability to do my own research, look this up. I rely heavily on social media and virtual support groups, local support groups. So those for me have been key. And so I use those resources wherever I can. And then, like I said, I'm motivated at my young age to go out and look at things myself. I'm driven that way, and I'm also open to trying new things and giving them a shot. And usually, like, I do understand neuroplasticity takes quite a while, but I'm also, if I don't see, I give it the time, you know, whatever the therapist recommends, 10 sessions or 2 to 3 sessions. And if I don't see even something, I usually kind of give up, which maybe is premature, but for me, I also need to look at the long term and of course, financial. Trying to look at my notes. So yeah, just having access to therapists and guidance has been probably one of my main struggles as a young person, and having not having programming available to me and that are suitable to my needs. So I think that's kind of what Patty was looking for as an introduction. So I'm going to leave it at that. And of course, at the end, if anybody has any questions for me and my condition or stroke in general, I'll gladly take those at the end.
Thank you very much, Amanda. That was, every time I hear your story, I'm moved by it. And I think you've learned so much that we'll really value all of our audience, who are mostly a health professional audience, but things that they can now take with them and share lessons learned with their patients as well. So we will now turn it over to Bobby, and I'll ask all the other participants to go off camera for the moment so that we just see Bobby. And Bobby, it's all yours.
Thank you, Patrice, and thank you to Lisa and the Heart and Stroke Foundation for organizing this webinar and for inviting me to talk about what I think is a pretty exciting topic. And thank you for registering and logging on to hear me share some of the research that I've done recently. So today I'll be talking about the science behind exercising the brain. And more specifically, I'll talk about some of the work that I've done recently and some of my ongoing work that examines whether or not exercising the brain leads to significant improvements to cognitive functioning. Now, before we get to that research, it's important to first ask, why is exercising the brain important? Well, it turns out that it's very important. Things like overall levels of happiness, academic and work success, and even life expectancy are all associated with healthy cognitive functioning. So in short, the better an individual's cognitive abilities, the higher their quality of life. Now, when I talk about exercising the brain, what immediately comes to mind for most people is brain training or cognitive training. And these are programs that entail completing one or a few online tasks that are designed specifically to improve your cognitive functioning. Now, I just provided a list of benefits associated with quality of life. And so finding a way to improve and maintain healthy cognitive functioning is certainly a worthwhile endeavor. And maybe brain training provides a way of achieving that goal. And now, while this is true for everyone, it might be particularly true for individuals who are most at risk for experiencing cognitive decline. And this includes age-related decline, as you can see in the solid black line in the figure here, or more accelerated cognitive decline due to the onset of dementia or different stages of dementia seen here in the dotted line. Brain training may also prove to be useful for individuals who've been diagnosed with cardiovascular disease. Recent research has shown that those with a low cardiovascular health score show the steepest declines in cognitive abilities. And in fact, there are strong links between cardiovascular disease and dementia, which ultimately leads to significant impairments to cognitive functioning. So it's no surprise that there's a lot of interest in applying these brain training programs to individuals who are concerned with or perhaps experiencing changes in their cognitive functioning due to the onset of dementia or cardiovascular disease, in hopes of not only slowing the cognitive decline, but perhaps improving or restoring cognitive abilities to levels they were at before the onset of the dementia or cardiovascular disease. And in fact, this is a thriving area of research. There are numerous, sorry, went too far. There are numerous studies that have used various brain training programs to individuals that belong to different clinical subpopulations. And in fact, a quick search of this literature reveals a number of papers that have been published that do in fact show that the decline in cognition can be slowed, and in some cases, for certain clinical populations, cognition can be improved. And so it's studies like this and many, many more studies in non-clinical populations that have spearheaded what is now a billion-dollar industry with estimates of more than 70 million active brain trainers. And the appeal of brain training, the reason why this industry is growing so quickly, is completely understandable. The brain training industry basically promises that you can sit comfortably on your couch, pick up an iPad, play a few games, and poof, you'll suddenly become smarter. But with claims like that, this begs the question, does this actually work? Does brain training really improve cognitive functioning? So we've done a number of studies to assess whether or not this is true. But before we get to that research, I want to go over what brain training is and how it's studied. Now, all of brain training studies, most brain training studies, have the same underlying structure to them. And that is, a group of participants complete a set of test tasks in a pre-training period to acquire a baseline measure of cognitive abilities. This is then followed by a training period where participants train on a single or a couple of tests that target a specific cognitive ability, and that most commonly is working memory. And this is then followed by a post-training period where participants complete the same set of test tasks they completed before the training started. Now, all of brain training studies also have the same primary objective, and that is to produce generalizable improvements to cognition. And in the context of this example, what that means is that participants will perform better on the test task after the training than they did before the training. Now, in addition to the same underlying structure to the studies, brain training studies are also evaluated on the exact same metric, and that is transfer. And transfer refers to whether and to what degree the training program transfers to untrained tasks, to other tasks. So in other words, how generalizable is the improvements due to cognitive training? So participants improve on tasks that are quite similar to the tasks used in training that rely on similar cognitive mechanisms, then this would be evidence for near transfer. But if participants improve on tasks that are completely unrelated, that tap into completely different cognitive abilities, for instance, mathematical processing, then this would be evidence of far transfer. And in fact, the brain training industry claims that after brain training, various cognitive systems will improve that we sort of use and recruit in daily living, for instance, while grocery shopping. And that would be an example of far transfer. Now, despite the fact that all brain training studies have the same similar structure and that all brain training studies are evaluated based on the same concept of transfer, there is considerable amount of variability in the scientific literature in the way that brain training studies are conducted, in the way they're analyzed, and in the way they're interpreted. And there are a number of reasons why that's the case. For instance, there are inconsistent definitions of what constitutes near and far transfer. And this is primarily driven because of inconsistent criteria for selecting training and test tasks. Beyond that, there are no standards or minimum requirements or suggested duration of training to produce the benefits of brain training. There are also inconsistent use of control groups. After all, the only way to claim that brain training works is to show that those who brain trained performed better than a group of control participants who didn't do any training at all. And finally, most of the studies in the brain training literature use very small samples. And the problem with that is that these studies are underpowered, and underpowered studies increase the likelihood of finding false positives and decrease the likelihood of replicating those findings. So in a series of studies that I'll talk to you about in a second, we wanted to address the question that I posed to you earlier. Does brain training actually work? But we wanted to do this by specifically targeting the list of pitfalls I just provided to you that are so common in the brain training literature. And on the first study, we took what we call a targeted brain training approach. And so what we did was we used empirical measures of similarity to select the training tasks and the test tasks. And this allows us to provide an objective and quantifiable definition of transfer. Now you may ask, how do we go about quantifying the similarity of cognitive tasks? Well, we do this by using an online cognitive battery called Cambridge Brain Sciences. And this is a battery that's comprised of 12 cognitive tasks, which you can see in the figure here. And these tasks measure various aspects of cognition, including inhibition, cognitive control, attention, executive processing. And one of the main advantages of using the Cambridge Brain Sciences platform is that these tests have been completed over 6 million times from over 100,000 participants. And so we could use that data to group together the 12 tests in a way that the individual tests are unified by a similar underlying structure. And so when we do that, we find 3 components or 3 underlying factors that best describe these 12 tests. As you can see, they're color coordinated in the figure here. The first 3 tests are grouped together by the first component represented by memory. The second component, reflecting reasoning, clusters the next 6 tests, and the final 3 tests are grouped together based on their similarity in terms of verbal processing. And now, using this factor structure, we're now able to, we now have a means of quantifying the degree of similarity between the different tests in this battery using objective and quantifiable measures. And so, equipped with that, we wanted to, we ran our brain training study, where we selected a task called the self-ordered search task. This is a working memory task that participants find quite challenging, but what we've shown is that after some training, participants can get really good at this task. And in that sense, this is a valuable and almost ideal task for brain training, because we know that participants will get better. But more importantly, using the factor loadings, these quantifiable measures of similarity, we were able to select 2 test tasks that objectively and quantifiably assess near and far transfers. So in the first task, spatial span, you can see here that that belongs to the same category as self-ordered search, which means that if participants improve on this task, that would be evidence for near transfer. The second task, we selected digispan down here, which you can see belongs to the verbal domain, but if you look at the factor loadings, there's also elements of working memory or short-term memory to this task. And so if participants improved on this task, that would be evidence of far transfer. So in total, we had 72 participants. They trained for about 15 hours over 20 days, which is actually a considerable amount of training when compared to what's commonly done in the literature. So what do we find? So as predicted, we found that participants got really good at the training task. As you can see here, each one of those red lines reflects an individual participant's performance over the 20-day training period. As you can see on the horizontal axes, and their performance is on the vertical axes. And relative to the first day, participants got much better. But we knew that. So what we were interested in was whether or not this improvement on the training task transferred to the 2 test tasks. And what we find is, when you look at performance on the digispan, which would have been evidence for far transfer, participants' performance post-training is actually the exact same as it was at pre-training. In fact, we don't even find near transfer. As you can see on the figure on the right, performance on the spatial span task at post-training is nearly identical to what it was at pre-training. So here we find evidence that when you use quantifiable measures to select test tasks, we find no evidence of transfer. Now, we thought maybe the contrived laboratory setting isn't an ideal context for assessing the subtle benefits of brain training. And so the next study, we wanted to assess brain training in real world settings. That is, how it's used and practiced in the real world. And so to do that, we recruited over 1,000 active brain trainers, some of whom have been practicing, have been doing brain training for up to 5 years, using at least one of these 4 brain training apps. These are 4 of the most popular brain training apps. And the reason why we wanted to do this was perhaps these apps have designed tests that are just better at extracting the potential benefits of brain training than the tests that we've used. And so to do that, we wanted to compare cognitive performance of the brain trainers relative to thousands of non-brain trainers. And so to do that, both groups of participants completed the same set of 12 tests that comprise the Cambridge Brain Sciences platform. But in addition to the performance on 12 tests, we also calculated their performance in the 3 cognitive domains. And you remember those were memory, verbal, and reasoning abilities. And I'll show you the results as they pertain to those 3 domains, because these are precisely the types of measures that brain training programs purport to improve. These are general underlying cognitive processing. And if you look at the figures, what we see is that brain trainers on the left side versus non-brain trainers show no differences in their cognitive abilities across the 3 domains. And in fact, if we focus just on those who brain train, it actually made no difference how long they brain train. There were just no improvements to their cognitive abilities independent of how long they brain trained. So this is providing further evidence that with large samples in real-world settings, there's no evidence that brain training is leading to better cognitive functioning. In the next study, we turned our attention to the brain in brain training. And we did that because we wanted to determine whether or not there are brain-based mechanisms that might provide a viable mechanism by which training on one test might transfer to another test. And specifically, we were interested in changes in functional connectivity as a measure of changes to brain activity. Now, functional connectivity is just a fancy way of saying we were interested in the degree to which different brain areas interacted with each other. And then we wanted to assess the relationship between these changes in brain activity and changes to their cognitive performance during the training period. Now, in this study, we had 16 participants, 8 in each group. Each group trained on a specific cognitive task. Now, importantly, both groups were tested on the same 2 test tasks. Again, providing a quantifiable and objective measure of near and far transfer for both groups. Participants in both groups trained for about 10 hours over a 30-day period. And to assess changes to their brain, during that period, participants came into the lab at 5 different occasions, and we measured their brain activity using fMRI, or functional magnetic resonance imaging. And in total, we were able to acquire 80 scanning sessions. And for anyone who's ever done any neuroimaging, you can appreciate how much data that is and how difficult it is to acquire that. Now, I do want to say that this data, this project is very much ongoing, but I'm excited to share with you some of our preliminary findings. Now, first, I'll talk about their behavioral changes. So as we've shown in the past and as predicted, participants in both group 1 in the top row and participants in the second group in the bottom row significantly improved on this task. Now you'll see that participants improved to different rates, and participants in group 1 improved at a different rate than participants in group 2. And you can see that in the different colored lines in both plots. But you can see that everyone improved. Now, if you look at the individual colored dots on the left side, you can see some individuals improved at different rates. So some participants improved faster, slower than other participants, but everyone improved. But we knew that. So now we wanted to see what's happening to the brain. How is the brain changing? Specifically, how is the brain's functional connectivity? How is the brain interacting with itself differently as participants improve on this task? So to do that, we took the 5 sessions that participants came into the lab and recorded their brain activity, and we lumped that data together to determine whether or not the brain mechanism of interest, that is functional connectivity, changed during this training period. Now, before we get to that, it was important for us to first carve out each individual's brain into 7 distinct components. Now, these components are well validated and reliable components that sort of reflect distinct underlying neural processes. And the reason we did that was so that we can more easily assess how the brain's functional connectivity, or again, the degree to which it's interacting both within networks, as you can see here in the purple network on the right, but also between networks. We can see in the lower image there, the arrow crossing different networks. And we wanted to see whether these changes across networks differed. And so let me show you what we find. Now, this looks like an overwhelming figure, but let me walk you through it. What we see on the vertical axes is the degree of functional connectivity, or again, how much the brain is interacting with itself. On the horizontal axes, we have the 5 scanning sessions. Now, the different colored lines in each of the figures represents each of the 7 networks that we carved the brain into. Now, if you look at the top row, what we see is the degree of functional connectivity within each of the 7 networks. And if you focus your attention on the lower row, the bottom row, you see the degree of functional connectivity between the frontal parietal network and the other 6 networks. And we focus on the frontal parietal network because this is a network that's been associated with higher level cognitive processing. The network that you would think, that we thought brain training would really change. Now, all I want you to extract from this figure is that the lines move in different directions for group 1, which you can see in the left column, and group 2 in the right column. And what this means is that the underlying brain mechanisms, the neural mechanisms that underlie changes in performance of this task are different. Now, we also wanted to see, we want to examine the relationship between these changes to the brain and changes to performance. And what we see here is, again, on the vertical axis, we see a measure of within versus between connectivity. This is just a composite measure that we calculate to encapsulate changes in functional connectivity across the whole brain. And again, on the horizontal axis, we see changes in cognition for group 1 on the left and group 2 on the right. And again, all I want you to extract from this figure is that the relationship between changes in the brain and changes or improvements in the task are completely different between the 2 groups. Now, this suggests that there is no viable mechanism by which brain training would transfer to another task. The mechanisms associated with improvements on task 1 in the brain look completely different than they do in group 2. Now, I've now shown you a number of studies where we find no evidence for brain training. And this is true in the lab setting, in the real world setting, and we look specifically within the brain. However, I discussed a number of findings at the start of my talk, just outlining potential benefits of brain training, specifically in clinical populations. Now, let's revisit that work. It turns out that upon closer examination of this literature, the exact same set of pitfalls I described earlier in non-clinical populations apply in these studies as well. That is, inconsistent definitions of near and far transfer, no criteria or inconsistent criteria for task selection, no minimum requirements or recommendations for how long participants or patients should be training for, inconsistent use of control groups, and very small samples. And in fact, for all the studies showing that there are positive effects of brain training, there's an equal number of studies showing that, in fact, brain training doesn't work in individuals with dementia or cardiovascular disease or different clinical populations. So I'll end by saying that we find no evidence for brain training. Specifically, when we target the list of pitfalls that I outlined earlier, that while participants do improve on the training task, there's no evidence that that improvement transfers or generalizes to other cognitive tasks, even when those tasks are very similar to the training task. And I'll end by saying that within the context of brain training, people are often seeking a magic pill that completing a few online games will lead to generalizable and overall improvements to cognition. But I'd like to say that when studying or trying to understand something as complicated as improving higher level cognitive functioning, especially in clinical populations, that will never come in a magic pill. And with that, I want to thank my collaborators for helping with these studies, to you for listening, and the Heart and Stroke Foundation for hosting this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Bobby. That was an amazing presentation. We greatly appreciate it. And we'll now switch over to our next 2 presenters, Julie and Ada. And Bobby, you can go off camera for the moment. And so Julie and Ada are going to talk to us about the community exercise programs, another way of exercise. Over to you.
Great, thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you again for having us join everyone on this webinar. We're really thrilled to be able to share our work on exercise for the body. Just trying to advance the slides. we're going to use Fit for Function, which is a community-based exercise program that that I've had the pleasure of working on with Julie and some of our colleagues here in Hamilton. But we're also going to speak broadly around exercise in general and how that's helpful for people with stroke. I don't really need to talk to this audience about why we care about stroke. I think it's very clear, especially to all of you who've joined us here over your lunch hour, that stroke we know is really important. The evidence that we have around the importance of fitness after stroke has been evidenced many, many times. Michelle Plowman and Liam Kelly published this really interesting article kind of highlighting why fitness is important in stroke. And when we look at this figure here, we can see you know, the different metabolic requirements for doing a lot of our everyday activities, everything from ADLs to IADLs, and how they increase over the course of activities, all the way to kind of climbing stairs and sport and higher intensity activities. What they also showed in this figure is the hashtag is where the threshold is for independence in instrumental activities of daily living. So doing things beyond the home environment, you know, operating in your community, doing a lot of the bigger picture things like grocery shopping and banking and going to work and going to school, etc. So this would be where the threshold for independence in these IADLs would be. And when they looked at the number of studies that have measured where peak fitness is in people with stroke, they all cluster to the below this value. So, you know, where the peak level of fitness is for these people with stroke is not even at the level that's required for higher level community tasks. The other thing to note is that physical activities levels are low in people with stroke, and this is just one study that has shown, you know, the relationship between performance on a clinical measure and what people do in real life. So in the scatter plot, we have across the bottom, you know, distance walked on the 6-meter walk test. So the further distance, the further along they are on this figure. And then activity counts measured by an accelerometer on the y-axis. So the higher up on the graph, the more activity they're engaging during the day. And so you can see that there's a nice positive relationship here. So the further they walk on the 6-minute walk test likely translates to higher activity in everyday activity. But the interesting thing to note here is that a lot of the scatter plot actually clusters down along the bottom. So even people who are walking at quite high distances in 6-minute walk tests, 400, 500 meters, they still have very, very low activity counts. So what we measure perhaps on a performance measure may or may not translate into real life. So the evidence that we know about the effectiveness of exercise is a positive one. So we know that aerobic training and mixed training, meaning a combination of aerobic and strength or resistance training, is effective for improving a number of outcomes like walking speed, like walking endurance and fitness. And this has been shown in a Cochrane review. But we also know that there haven't been as many opportunities for community exercise as we might like, and as that would be supported by the evidence. Certainly, this is changing, and there's a lot of amazing initiatives that are out there for groups that are trying to implement community exercise programs. But when you think about the difference between cardiovascular disease and stroke and the availability of, you know, really well-established cardiac rehab programs, those analogous programs for the stroke population just is not at the same scale just yet. So is there a gap between, you know, the evidence and what opportunities are out there? The good news is that there are a lot of great initiatives that are happening, and it's great to be able to speak to many of you from across the country who are leading some of these initiatives. And I think Canada has really been on the map for developing evidence-based community exercise programs for stroke. I'm going to highlight 3 programs that have been developed within Canada. One of them is TIME, the Together in Movement and Exercise, and that's been led in Toronto through UHN, Toronto Rehab, as well as the University of Toronto. The FAME program, which is Fitness and Mobility Exercise, and that has was started in BC at UBC, and then our program here in the Hamilton area in South Central Ontario is Fit for Function, and that this is a program that we've developed together with the YMCA, Hamilton Health Sciences, and us here at MAC. The evidence for community exercise programs so far, both Time and FAME have been around a lot longer than Fit for Function, and they've really been leading the way in developing the evidence around these community exercise programs. It's great news that the event rates have been low for adverse events, as well as any falls that have occurred in the course of these programs have been minimal and all non-injurious. These programs have also been shown to be effective in improving a number of different physical function measures, such as balance, 6-minute walk test distance, overall fitness, so this is peak oxygen consumption, muscle strength, as well as some translation into some cognitive function as well, so improvements in executive function. When we think about these programs and the different characteristics of the programs, I drew this table just to kind of highlight some of the features of the program so we can do a little bit of comparison across them. And you can see that there's a lot of similarities across the programs, which is great. We're all approaching community programs in a similar way, recognizing that a group format is really important for this population. 60 minutes of exercise is typical. Usually 1 to 2 days a week of exercise, and the ratio of staff to participant is about 1 to 4. So that has, in all of our programs, has shown to be safe to be able to manage a group setting. In terms of the settings, both Time and FAME have been operating out of community centers, and for Fit for Function, we use the YMCA. The durations of the programs are very similar, about 12 weeks in duration. And then in terms of the eligibility of people coming into these programs, also again, very similar. The requirement of just being able to walk 10 meters, so independently with a gait aid, but without physical assistance of another person. So really broad in terms of eligibility for walking, you know, as little as 10 meters. They have to be able to perform some level of standing balance activities and be able to tolerate the 60 minutes of activity with rest and follow instructions. And there's a few kind of individual differences between our programs. For example, Time has a maximum ability of being able to walk 20 to 30 minutes without seated rest. So anyone who exceeds this is probably too high level for Time. And then if you look across to Fit for Function, in our program, we require a physician to provide that medical clearance for them to participate. In terms of the exercises, they're all very similar and very based on the evidence of aerobic and mixed training and taking a really functional approach that includes balance training and mobility training in a kind of circuit style. And then finally, who delivers the program is generally fitness instructors through the community centers or through the YMCA. And all of our programs, to some degree, have some support from a health professional, a physiotherapist, or some other health professional that can help provide consultation to the fitness instructors for delivering the program. I'd like to turn it over now to my colleague, Julie Richardson, who's going to talk a little bit more about Fit for Function.
Thank you very much. Yeah. This is right. Okay, so sorry, I went too fast. Okay, so thank you, Ada. So we've been fortunate in this community to have a community partnership called Live Well, which has involved 3 agencies or 3 institutions, the YMCA, Hamilton Health Sciences, and McMaster University. And these 3 institutions have come together to provide specialized programming for people who want to continue to exercise after some health event, but would not be able to participate in a normal program. And so stroke is one of the programs that is provided for Fit for Function. But there are other programs for children with developmental disabilities, heart disease, joint disease. There's actually about 12 programs that are provided through this partnership. And as you can see on the slide, each institution has their own role in the partnership in terms of delivering the program. The YMCA actually does the screening of participants for the intake and provides day-to-day support of the program. This has also received support from a health professional from Hamilton Health Sciences, 0.1 full-time equivalent to support community staff, and McMaster University provides evaluation and outcome and support around outcome measures to the program for Fit for Function. So the YMCA that we've been involved with is the Hamilton, Burlington, Brantford, and the YMCA of Niagara. So Ada gave you a little bit of information about the what the participants actually receive, but for the program that we have been involved with, the Fit for Function program that we've been involved with, there was group exercise twice a week for an hour each time, and then on Fridays there was an opportunity for people to participate and drop in to exercise by themselves, which would be supported by a fitness instructor on the floor. As well as that, there was a group education session for 1 hour, which was called Living with Stroke. So the group exercise program, which was held twice a week, began with a dynamic warm-up for about 10 minutes, and that involved concentrating on posture, controlled breathing, and ankle mobility, and marching on the spot with the type of exercises participants were involved in the warm-up. Then they moved on to, first of all, task-orientated strengthening and conditioning for 20 minutes. And as you can see here, this is all evidence-based interventions, and you can see we've referenced the evidence here on the slide. And so the type of activity that was involved here was walking, where people were expected to experience a perceived exertion of around 3 to 4 out of 10, and they would be on a 40-meter square course. Then they did sit to stand 10 times times 3 times, and then heel raises, which were for 5 minutes each. The next part was mobility and balance for 20 minutes. And these were exercises that tapped into the mobility and balance. And so people, first of all, did walking and standing and carrying different objects of different sizes and weights. And so it was sort of practicing dual task activities. Then they would do different stepping patterns, forward, sideways, tap-ups or step-ups, and leading with each foot. And so this gave them an opportunity to practice different sort of sequencing in stepping. And finally, they did different balance exercises in standing, which involved the use of their upper extremity, using reaching overhead, and involved weight shifting and different balance exercises. The cool down, which was for 10 minutes, involved controlled deep breathing and various stretching exercises. The once a week independent exercise was really important because it facilitated integration into the fitness center without structured class. And it normalized the experience of exercise. So the idea is that people might need to come back to Fit for Function at various times, but it isn't the idea that it would necessarily be a continuous experience. And so the hope is that they would, with support in the gym, be able to integrate into a usual exercise program. And then finally, the topics for the education session, which was Living with Stroke, were understanding stroke, looking at the physical changes and challenges, swallowing and nutrition, cognition, perception and communication, emotions focusing on depression, activities and relationships, reducing the risk of stroke and moving forwards after stroke. And the important thing is that often caregivers came to these sessions as well. So we evaluated the program through support from the Canadian Institute of Health Research, and we randomized our people to fit for function or to a standardized YMCA membership. We measured at baseline and 12 weeks later and following 24 weeks following baseline. These were the outcomes that we looked at. So we found that there was a very low dropout for the Fit for Function program. There was no difference in the reintegration to normal living index, but there was an improvement in terms of the 6-meter walk distance, the physical performance battery, and the knee extension strength, and higher self-efficacy for physical activity, as well as higher self-efficacy for chronic disease management. And this was just a quote from a participant, which I'll let you read by yourself in the interest of time. But the critical components for community exercise programs, which Ada's also given you some ideas about this. I think accessible community space, supervision by a fitness instructor or athletic therapist to deliver the program who has experience with stroke is preferable, but training's essential. Consultation by a physiotherapist around tailoring of exercises and making individual exercises more challenging. Options for independent exercise outside the community program. And the program should address flexibility, strengthening and aerobic exercise, and evaluation around change in activity and function and adherence is important. And these are the people that we'd just like to acknowledge, because it did take a village to complete our evaluation of Fit for Function. Thank you.
All right, so thank you everyone. My name is Andrea and I work here at Heart and Stroke. And first of all, thank you to all our presenters for providing such a detailed and interesting and important topic to us. So we just have a couple minutes left for questions. So I have a question for Amanda here. So Amanda, what advice did you receive from other people with lived experience regarding fitness after you experienced your strokes?
Well, a lot of my advice actually came from, I would say, support groups online, found through like social media, through Facebook and stuff. But I'm not even sure what I really learned from them. I guess just to keep going, motivation that things get better. I think that was the main thing, was the motivation and finding ways to move past what I was experiencing. That was the main advice I would have found. So
great, thank you. So Julie and Ada, this is a question for you. And someone's asking, what are the benefits of the group portion of the class? Why are groups so important for the community exercise programs?
I think we found that certainly the group provides the social aspect and the peer support that is so invaluable. It's so much more important than if it's just a therapist or not just a therapist, but one therapist or one fitness instructor with one participant. They get a tremendous amount of support from each other. I know that in our programs they'll end up meeting for coffee afterwards, and that kind of helps with the socialization, the social integration, community integration, where they can build and develop their social support network even further. I think, you know, the other thing I want to add to, it's not just for the participants with stroke, but I think the caregivers also develop their own kind of sense of community when they may accompany their family member or the person to the program, and they're sitting downstairs having coffee and perhaps socializing with other caregivers as well.
I think the other thing, oh, sorry. I was just going to say, I think the other thing is that we noticed is that they start to access some of the other wide programs with other participants. So they might go swimming together or something like that outside Fit for Function.
Great, thank you. And one last question for me. Someone's asking if you'll be sharing, or if there's any way you share your brain training tools. Are those available anywhere?
So the brain training apps that I discuss are available online. We don't have a brain training tool. We just have a platform of cognitive tests to assess cognitive abilities. But yeah, if people want to go to cambridgebrainsciences.com, they can see the test for themselves.
All right, so on that note, I know there's a few more questions coming in. For time, we're going to end it now, but you're welcome to email our email, strokebestpractices@heartandstroke.ca with additional questions. It's up on the screen there. So to conclude again, thank you so much to Amanda, Ada, Bobby, and Julie for the webinar that you presented. We've had some great engagement, and everyone have a great afternoon. Thank you very much.